This is ColoniaCast, episode 49. Today we are joined by Kim Titterington, who is the founder and director of Swamp Girl Adventures. Kim wears many hats as an educator, where she has shared her knowledge and fascination with the herpetofauna of Florida and beyond with millions of people through social media and in-person presentations. As a conservationist, where she's added a whole new dimension to different projects like the Santa Fe River Turtle Project and what can be done there. And is a registered wildlife rehabilitator with the state of Florida, where in 2022 alone, her group, Swamp Girl Adventures, has helped rehabilitate over 700 reptiles and amphibians from over 28 different counties in Florida. Just the breadth of experience and accomplishments is really a testimony to Kim's palpable excitement for these really incredible animals, and we're really excited to talk to her today. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Sweet.
So, Kim, kind of to start off, we ask everybody this question. What first got you interested in turtles and tortoises?
Well, long story short, basically, I was born and raised in Florida, and I was kind of a Florida surprise. My family was actually originally from New York. So I had an older brother and sister, and then all of a sudden now they had this little one, and they had moved to Florida. So, there's a lot of things about Florida that can be dangerous, when you have a toddler and a baby and everything. But then at the same time, my brother had an interest in reptiles. He had a pet snake that he got from the Serpentarium down in South Florida all those years ago. And so that kind of gave me a little introduction. And then across the pond in our neighborhood, we had a neighbor who actually did educational programs about Florida's reptiles. And a lot of that was actually snake-based. And his son was the same age as me. So we kind of grew up together, and I had a lot of inspiration, I guess, with the reptiles. And one of the things that sparked me to move forward and do more with education was actually an incident when I was in second grade. Went to a bus stop, and all these kids were basically just, killing the snake and stomping on it. And, it really upset me. And I just didn't understand. I'm like, why would somebody do that, kind of thing. And that's where I learned that education was key. They misunderstood this animal. They see it as a threat, even though it wasn't. And a lot of times that leads to cruelty or unnecessary killing. And so at a very young age, I was really motivated to get people to see the nicer side of these animals and how important they are to our environment. And so that's kind of what sparked, I guess, my big interest in reptiles and to focus on that.
That's awesome. Did you, before you started your nonprofit, did you work with any other organizations to kind of get your feet off the ground?
Yeah. So by the time I was 14, I was actually already knocking on the door of a local zoo and saying, hey, can I come help? I want to come work here. I want to learn more. And then also at the same time, at the age of 14, I started doing educational programs for schools. So I would bring some of my pet reptiles into schools and introduce them to the children and stuff there. So I started pretty young, just doing that part. So then from there, once I was an age that I could actually hold a job. So by the time I was 16, I started actually working at a couple local zoos, including Gatorland. That was one of my first zoo and attractions, working with the gators and the snakes and stuff there. Earned my venomous hours over there. And then I went on to work as a veterinary assistant for several years, which gave me more of that medical background. Thankfully, I worked at a clinic that did have some exotic experience, so that really helped me out. And the vet that worked there is still a longtime friend of mine, and still helps me out here and there. But he was really interested in stuff I would just bring in cases all the time, and we'd work on them together. So I think that sparked that launch of knowledge and experience so I could continue on my own path.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's really cool. We all, Jack, Wyatt, and I all visited Gatorland pretty recently, and it was cool. I mean, we didn't really, at least I didn't know what to expect really going into it, but all the work that they're doing conservation-wise was really cool to see. And that's but talking about your path is really fascinating because like looking at what you're doing with Swamp Girl Adventures is real. It's interesting because you've got this kind of rehabilitation side, but also the education angle. And it seems like all those things kind of were motivated by the same interests, but came at different times.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what was it like to start once you got that experience and such? What did it take to start your nonprofit?
So what motivated to start was funding, because you can, once people kind of know you're there to take in animals. It started a lot with the exotics, and then of course wildlife kind of was hand in hand with it. But as soon as people knew that they could dump a snake or a turtle or something on you, and they didn't, of course, want to give donations. And unless you're a 501c3, you can't legally ask for donations. And so that really is what motivated and pushed me to say, okay, we gotta form a nonprofit organization to help fund all of these animals coming in so we can actually do more for them. And so that was probably the biggest motivation, is just having that structure so that we could get some kind of funding help, through a nonprofit. So that was kind of the launch of that, and it went from there.
That's cool. Yeah. So talking about doing the early presentations with schools, that's something we also have talked about just as a group of like inspiring. I mean, that's like the foundational level of education, is going into classrooms or just live presentations and inspiring people. I'm curious if you've got any early memories from before you had the whole Swamp Girl Adventures, your whole sort of initiative. Is there anything that stands out to you for moments when you were just like, wow, they've been inspired, or just interesting stories from early on?
Yeah, I mean, just having the neighbor who already was doing educational programs as it was definitely inspiring. And, I was always motivated on different people being on TV, and we did have, I can't think of his name right now. We did have someone come visit school. He used to do programs. This is back in the late 80s. But I don't think he's around anymore. But he came and brought like rattlesnakes and things like that into the school. And I just remember being so amazed at how awesome that they were. And so I think that inspired me to want to play that role and help and continue that. And I think, especially as I got a little older, I started seeing more and more of the lack of those kinds of things implemented into the school systems. And, growing up, I felt like all of my classes and even teachers were very, very misinformed about wildlife in general, especially reptiles. I mean, there's all kinds of things I had to argue with them about. I'm like, that is not true. That's not how it works. You don't cut snakes in half and they grow back together. I don't know what you're talking about. Just weird stuff like that I had to argue with them about. And I think that's a huge part, is we need to get younger individuals involved. Especially I've noticed that with the growth here in Florida, and I'm sure this is the same for any other growing area, but when I was growing up, I had all kinds of natural areas to go. I was playing in the swamps, I was playing in the ditches, and nowadays I feel like you don't see kids doing that, or they're just not able to. There's all these like there's natural areas are just few and far between on top of it. But then, there's so many restrictions, like you're going to get no trespassing, or it's owned by someone else, or it's under construction. I just feel like you just really can't explore as much as when I was growing up. I had the benefit of being able to just wander around and do that. And now everything's developed, like, there's no place to do it without having to take a drive somewhere to go do it. And I think that's really sad, and unfortunate. But that's why we need to get these kids on board and aware that, there's cool stuff out there. It's like, get them inspired, that if they see a snake in their backyard, that it's not a bad thing. If there's a frog crawling up the wall, it's not a bad thing. Possums crawling through the yard, it's okay. They have a place in our environment. Leave them alone. And if anything, go look them up. Go learn about them. Let's get them inspired. So
nice.
No, that's really great. I used to do like educational shows at nature centers and schools, and getting like the younger generation, the little kids involved. I mean, there'd always be a handful like every time that were like very interested in it and really actually did something with the information that I was spreading. And that was always a great feeling. But I mean, even I feel like there's having all the iPads and all the technology kind of takes away from having to go outside and find stuff. Like my family didn't let me have any of that until I was like in my middle school years. So
Mhm.
when I was a kid, I was just out catching stuff all the time, whether it was turtles in a pond or I was out on this beach with a seine net. Like I was always doing something.
Yeah, yeah. I think we need to have more resources and more encouragement of those things and activities. Um, uh, I'm also a dance teacher on the side. That's what helps pay the bills. So I also work with kids on that level, and I'm always so surprised when they come in. They end up getting a little bit of an extra education, not just dance. It's like there's a bird that flies to the window, or they see a little something crawling on the floor, a little spider. It's like the education starts. I'm like, okay, we're gonna stop dancing. We're gonna start learning about this for a moment. So it's just I have to implement it into everything and everything.
Right. It's interesting on your website too. You mentioned that there was a specific target for underserved areas and presenting in those types of situations, which is really cool. I think the impact you can have in a situation like that is disproportionate because if you inspire one kid, that could get them not only interested in something but out of a potentially bad situation through that motivation. Is there a difference that you've seen when presenting in areas that maybe are not as fortunate as other areas in terms of the reception for the ability to go and present somewhere like that? Is there a difference? Like, is it harder to get into certain places? And
Well, one thing that I will say right up front that has become a real hurdle is the cost of the liability insurance to even just go to present in schools anymore. It's completely limited us. And that's very frustrating because I feel like we're not able to reach students because of everyone's kind of sue happy, I guess you can say, but you can't even bring a gopher tortoise into an Osceola County school, for example, without having a $2 million policy. And that is a very costly thing to try to upkeep as a nonprofit, where most of our money is supposed to be going back into saving the animals, not thousands of dollars a year going into just to hold insurance. We don't even hardly charge that much or ask for a donation much for these programs. So we're not getting that back to do that. So, but other than that, getting away from that part of that hurdle, what I have noticed is that, areas like I grew up in kind of an underprivileged area. So a lot of my friends and everything, they didn't have a lot else to do. So they got into trouble, and everything. I won't go into too much detail, but there was all those things. But I stayed pretty busy, and I was really committed to the wildlife and everything. And I think having that direction showed me where that difference was. That it helped me to stay in a good level line, stay out of trouble, and just playing with the animals and everything. But I also saw that growing up in that area, how many kids just needed a little bit of motivation and a little bit more of understanding, a little more time. And a lot of people I grew up with, I just saw that. I was like, why, the teachers and stuff, they get frustrated with them. I'm like, they just need a different angle or a different approach. And I feel like, the same kind of goes through this. And I think getting into those underprivileged kids, giving them that chance to see something that they don't see every day is definitely, I think it's a different path. It really helps them. I do notice that they're a lot more receptive to it. They're more likely to ask. Other kids who are really busy on their phones, they just seem to get bored quickly, because they've always had everything they needed. And I think that they don't sit well with it. They're just kind of like, yeah, okay, that's kind of cool, and then move on. But when you have these other kids who may not have access to some of those, it's almost like this whole new world. And so I do feel they're more receptive.
That's really interesting.
I feel like in my experience, I've noticed incredible variation in the response like a little kid has to like any animal or whatever you're doing. Like some of them are just like not really that fazed by it. Like I remember back in the summer when I was doing sea turtle work, this boat was watching us. We caught a 300-pound loggerhead, and we went to show the kids, and like one of the kids was just like kind of looking like, oh, that's cool, and the other one was like going berserk, like it was the coolest thing he's ever seen. And it was like, that's probably had a huge impact. The fact that we got to let the kid come see these sea turtles we were working with that they're never going to be able to see otherwise. So that kind of impact is always like one of the coolest parts of all this to me.
Yeah. And I love seeing a kid who's very timid come up, they're kind of like, oh, I'm not so sure. But once they like start to touch the animal and learn about them, it's almost, then you can't get them to leave.
No, yeah.
They're locked in, and I'm like, okay, did my job. They're locked in. That's good. So you know that they're going to move on with a different respect after that moment, and I think that's what matters.
Yeah, that was even at the most recent filming event. There was a little girl that was with her parents, and it was just funny to watch because she was pretty timid, but she wanted to investigate everything and was getting excited with all of that. So that's another one. It's like, yeah, it's just even really young kids too. It's like there's so many different levels of experience. It's all a good thing.
Yeah. And I think the parents are the hardest part. They're usually the ones who are like, no, don't touch that. Don't go over there. Or they're the ones kind of flipping out, oh, that's a snake. I'm not going up there. And, that relays over to the children. And then then they're like, oh, I'm not going to go there. And so that's another thing that I've noticed is whenever I'm doing groups where parents are involved is a lot of times I'll try to get the parent involved first so that then they feel more comfortable and then get the kid to approach. Sometimes you kind of have to balance that out. Because sometimes the parents won't let their kids come to the table at all. So, there's no way you're going to have to get through the parent first and then let them come in. So, like I'll show them something else or, like deflect a little bit. And I'm like, okay, but now look how much closer you are. Look at this. Look how beautiful. Just, go ahead. Sometimes it just takes forcing.
I noticed the kids are so much more malleable than like the parents. Like you can they're usually not that difficult to get interested. I mean, in my experience, I didn't see a whole lot of kids that were outright afraid of or not in a way that you couldn't just show them and then they think it's cool. But some of the adults, it's like you can't get through to them. They're just like, oh, whatever, I'm wasting my time with this person. But the kids, it's like where you really make the impact, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
So one of the things that the rehabilitation aspect, there's a lot of you need permits for that and such, and you have a lot of really cool things that we'll get to talking about in terms of just technology too. But I'm curious up front, what is the process for someone that may not be familiar with the wildlife rehabilitator license in Florida? How did you get that? What kind of experience did you specifically get for that? What was the process?
Yeah, so it's something that it's definitely involved. It's a commitment. It's a life commitment. And I think that's where, and a lot of times you don't get paid for it. Like it's not one of those guaranteed paid jobs unless you're at like a larger facility. But if you were interested in becoming one and you're doing it either through your home or at whatever level it's going to be, basically to get started, you have to have 1,000 documented hours of working with or under a licensed wildlife rehabilitator. So, and basically with that documentation, you're documenting, what species are you working with raccoons and what did you do while working with the raccoons, or the squirrels, or, feeding, cleaning, medical treatments. So you basically have to document all of those things. And once you have those hours together, then at that point you can submit your application, but you have to also go through an inspection. So just because you know how to do these things doesn't mean that you're prepared to take them in. So the next level is, do you have proper caging? Do you have, say, a veterinarian or other medical supplies that you need to stabilize that animal and then take to the vet if needed? Sometimes you don't need it, but if they're orphaned animals, do you have the formula? Do you have the bottles? Do you have, all of those things? So once you go through all that, and then FWC will come and inspect your property and make sure that you're set up for what you choose. So in some cases, the rules are you're not supposed to turn away any wildlife unless you are not set up for them. So it's someone brings a bear to me, I'm like, I can't take a bear. I'm not set up for a bear. So then you do need to have a list of referrals or something like that to make sure that that animal goes to someone with knowledge and the ability. So those are all things that, you always kind of have to be prepared. You're always on call. So it's very stressful that way, but that's basically the process. Is once you get through all those hurdles, then you get that license, and then it renews about every 2 years. One of the only other shortcuts is if you get, I think you can do like 500 hours. I didn't do this way, but you can do like 500 hours and then you take a test. The biggest thing with the test that a lot of people have said is that it's mostly on like mammals and a lot on birds. Like there's just like birds and mammals. So there's not really much at all there in the test for reptiles. And that's because just reptiles and rehab aren't always seen as the same thing. it's really sad, but that's where I've been trying to change that. But yeah, that's pretty much the process to get to that license to be a rehabber.
Interesting. Is there, like, holistically, is there a sufficient number of rehabbers in Florida and elsewhere, or is this something we need more people?
I do think we need more people. I feel like we're doing pretty good when it comes to people who do like small mammals and birds. The birds actually also require, if you're doing anything that's the federal migratory birds. So there's actually a second license. If you want to specialize in birds or do birds a lot, then you're going to have to get that as well. And that also has a different requirement, like with a flight cage and all of those details. But again, not the path I traveled in. I focused on the reptiles. But yeah, it is something I think we need more of. I know people complain to me all the time. They're like, I'm calling and nobody answers the phone. And they just thank me for answering the phone, because they're like, even if it's not for something that I'm helping them with directly, they're just like, thanks for answering the phone and trying to give them another resource. And then, just a lot of rehab centers get really full, especially after natural disasters like hurricanes. It's like squirrels are just, they got 100 squirrels. They can't take one more thing. They're very overwhelmed during certain times like that, in certain seasons, certain breeding seasons. They always have baby season, and so those are big issues. But right now they are changing some rules in the wildlife rehab, and I can tell you that many wildlife rehabilitators, because of those rule changes, have chose not to renew their licenses. So we may end up with far less than we had. But I'm hoping that maybe we'll also have some new ones emerging, because we do need the help.
Interesting. And how do people reach you? Are you on? I know on your website there's you can report different cases and such. Is that solely how you get information for?
Yeah. So FWC has a wildlife rehabilitators list. So if you find injured or orphaned wildlife, there's a hotline and also a website link. And so if you call that link or then they will say, okay, what county are you in? And they'll try to give you the closest wildlife rehabilitator to you. And sometimes if there's more than one, they'll give you a couple resources. And then if you just go to the website, you can just look up your county and figure out who's there. And not every county has one. I'm the only one in my county that's licensed currently. So that's how you kind of find somebody, and hope that the numbers you're calling are also still doing it, because that's also been another complaint. They're like, I'm calling and they're saying that they don't even do this anymore, stuff like that. And so I think the list isn't always updated as well as it should be. I think they're working on that, but that's how it's found. Other than word of mouth, anybody else who has brought me an animal, if their friend or relative finds one, they're like, hey, I called this girl, I took it over to her, stuff like that. So I get a lot of calls from word of mouth, other wildlife rehabilitators, and then the FWC website are mostly how people find who we are. And then of course our Instagram, Facebook, all those things too. People reach out to me through those.
That's cool. So kind of talking about, I guess we can switch, like, that's an interesting process. And I knew that it was a capacity, but I didn't know a lot about it until researching for this. So it's cool that that's a thing people can do if you're dedicated and interested. And you don't necessarily need to go through vet school, all of that. It's intensive, but there's probably more flexible in some ways. So talking about just what you're seeing now and turtle wise specifically, that's kind of our main interest, but other things too, if it's interesting. I'm curious if the last year, maybe we can focus on that, or in a typical year, what proportion of rescues and situations are you seeing with turtles involved, and what are the most common issues you're seeing?
So, last year we had well over 700 come through. And just to hit on this point, this year we also hit a new record, which is always unfortunate. I hate to say record, but we are over 1,000 that came in this year. So, and that also does include some of the babies, but we definitely that were hatched after save, but we can get into that later. We with most of what we see is turtles and tortoises, though. And I think the reason for that is that, people are more likely to help a turtle or tortoise, you're not usually seeing someone who's like, oh, an injured snake, or my cat got a hold of a snake. They're usually like, oh my gosh, is my cat okay? Not, this poor snake is sitting there dying. Not that we don't get people who you do bring them, which is, I'm always thanking them. I'm like, thank you for taking the time to help a snake. I think we probably had about 20 snake cases this year, maybe about 15 last year in those total numbers. So they don't make up a large amount, but they do make up some. And then frogs come in there. You would think that more people would say frogs, but we don't get as many amphibian calls or needs. But, we have had a handful of those, but the majority really is the turtles and tortoises. The biggest issue is hit by car. The next one that comes in from that is actually dog chew or bite cases or attacks. So that they're a close second actually this year. We're riding pretty close. So once Florida started growing so much more, we have people coming from other states that don't even know what a gopher tortoise is. So, or, that we have all this wildlife. And so their dogs are just getting a hold of stuff and they're like, I don't even know what it is. I don't know how it got there. And I'm like, they live in your yard. They didn't even know what a burrow was. And it becomes this whole other educational thing. But yeah, the dog attacks and the dog bite victims, they're nasty, nasty wounds. And we're seeing a lot of those. And then what comes in after that, I would say, is probably the disease and illness factor. And then thankfully the one that rides at the bottom would be, a cruelty or intent of hurting them. We do get those cases every year, but thankfully they're not at the level, not at the top of the list.
As far as like species, like what's like, and like, what are the most common turtle species that you get? And like, what are the rarer ones and how, like, what do you see most often?
Most often the ones that usually it would be gopher tortoises. I think the fact that, they live on land and they are going to come in contact with people the most. And whether it's their dog getting a hold of it or that, they just moved into the area and, development, hit by cars, all those kind of things, noticing that there's a diseased or sick animal, because they do now moved on to habitat where tortoises reside, then they're more likely to notice that one is just sitting there or not acting normally. So I think that's where the increase is. Also, people, I think, feel a little bit more sensitive to the gopher tortoises. Once at least they know that, because I've had people say, it's a snapping turtle. No, it's not. You can touch it. Just pick it up and move it, please. They're afraid to touch it. They won't come out of their house because there's a gopher tortoise out there. So we have those cases. But more often than not, people are like, oh my gosh, they're protected. How can I help them? So I get a lot of gopher tortoises. And then the next one probably down the line is definitely the cooter species. Cooter species, and then soft shells and common snappers are usually a nice bulk of the water turtle group. And then the smaller ones like little musk turtles, striped mud turtles. We get a lot of striped mud turtles that come through with the smaller species. And then chicken turtles, we get those, which is kind of cool. And then, of course, the occasional exotic that I'm like, we'll get a map turtle or something, Mississippi maps, painted turtles, and things like that. That'll just show up randomly. It's Florida.
Yeah, I would expect that. Yeah, I mean, do you ever see sulcatas? Like
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sulcatas, and last year, redfoots. Like there was this redfoot bloom last year. This year was Russian tortoises. That was like, they were just like, I don't know, like I had like a 2-week span where there's like 6 cases of Russian tortoises. Okay. It was just crazy. I don't know. It was like season change, and then they're all just, I don't know, people were just dumping them off or they were just on the move. But yeah, and definitely sulcatas, and they come in with a lot of the same issues. It's not necessarily that they're just found, but they're found because a dog got a hold of them or because they were hit by a car, things like that. So some of them have the same issues.
Are there any unique, like, species specific issues that you see? I mean, just thinking about like chicken turtles, perhaps that's one that almost, we've talked about them in a good number of past discussions, and they're always unique in every way. So I don't know if is there an issue chicken turtles or other species have that you see consistently that others don't?
Yeah, their main issue is being hit by cars. And because otherwise these guys, you don't see them, like even when you're going looking for them, you don't really see them very often, very aloof animals. But during certain seasons, I know what season we're in, because we'll get a flood of males. So you get all these little males that are getting hit by cars or showing up in people's yards, because, breeding season. And then as we get into the like late fall, early winter, then all of a sudden we're getting the females, and they're like full of eggs, and then they're either getting hit by a car, or we've had a couple that were actually dog chew victims because they were, in someone's yard laying eggs and very vulnerable at that time. So with females who are laying eggs, usually become victims to dogs in those urban areas. But yeah, and the thing is with the chicken turtles that's really cool to me is that how they fracture is almost always repairable. They heal just so incredibly well, and they seem quite tolerant. Not all of them, obviously, but quite tolerant of some of these fractures. And I feel like it's just how they're built. Is just I think it has an advantage to being struck, and how they fracture, and then they always come back together usually pretty well. So yeah, they're really cool. They're really cool. I hate to see them injured, but at the same time, I'm always like, "Ooh, chicken turtle."
Yeah. Have you ever seen a Florida mud turtle? Like, you ever get those in, or is that like?
Yeah. Not as often.
I'd
Like
imagine
maybe a handful a year with the Florida muds. Yeah. And I think if I covered a bit more South Florida, maybe I'd see them a little bit more often. But I have had them around Central Florida. They do pop up on occasion.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's usually just, common musk and the striped mud turtles is our smaller ones we see.
When it comes to healing, are the chicken turtles the best at that, or are there other species that use with turtles?
I feel like I would say that they are the best, and I'm not exactly sure why. Like I said, I don't know if it's just because how they fracture is usually far less messy. It's usually fairly clean. And it comes back together pretty well. But I think, sometimes gopher tortoises are pretty good, but common snapping turtles, I think, are another one that I feel like are really resilient and heal really well. With a lot of I just got one a common snapper in last night, actually, that was it's almost like being scalped. The top of the carapace was shaved back, and you could even see the vertebrae there, like little chunks, and a little tiny piece of lung was actually kind of pushing through the muscle, and but all limbs worked because it went this way and not this way. So I was like, all right, bonus. And it's just like wound management, but because it just the way their structure is, I've had them heal from those kind of injuries that look really bad really well. So I feel like it granulates and heals really well with the common snappers with those kind of injuries. So I think those would be the top two.
Yeah, it's fascinating. The turtle healing capacity is just incredible to me. It's just all the vasoconstriction, and the fact that so little is. I mean, you look up studies on that subject, and there's not a lot that's been looked at. There's so much there.
Mm-hmm.
And you've got this experience hands-on seeing a lot of this, so it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
What species do you? I was gonna say, what species do you like see are the most sensitive or don't usually recover as well? Like if the chicken turtles are up there, like what's the species that usually doesn't do very well?
Soft shell turtles, I feel like, are either going to go really well or just really bad, really wrong. And I think they can go really well because of, again, their structure, how their shell comes out, and those, modified rib bones that kind of spread. When they get run over, it actually disperses the weight, and it protects the inner organs pretty well. So other than having, more of the plastron fractures that can happen with that from the impact, a lot of times we see them recover really well, even though they were like completely run over. But then, of course, depending on how they get run over and the extent of the weight of that vehicle, then, they can also be extremely vulnerable. And I see a lot of internal bleeding with them is the biggest issue. A lot of times the top looks great. It did its job, but it just wasn't enough. Yeah. And so then you'll look underneath and you see that they're all bruised and they're bleeding out and, and bleeding from the mouth. And it's like, okay, yeah, it's internal, even though there's not a scratch on the top, and which is really unfortunate. But yeah, I feel like the soft shells can go it's either going to be good or it's going to be bad.
With regard to the cutaneous health, something about soft shells in captivity, at least, it seems like they're prone to a lot of shell infections, shell rot, and fungus. But in the wild, at least in Southern California, we've got introduced spiny soft shells. And I've seen the most of those in some of the dirtiest habitats. So I don't know, have you, in the wild, do you get a lot of situations where you've got shell infections with soft shells or other turtles, or is that not something you see as much, more captive related?
Yeah, I don't usually see it as much. I have seen it where an animal was obviously released, into the wild, but as a pet, like somebody may have found a cooter when it was a baby and outgrew the tank, and you can see all the pyramiding, and and then you see that they might have like shell rot and retained scutes and keratin, and you're like, okay, yeah, this one somebody dumped this animal. So but usually in the wild, not so much. Not unless there's some kind of secondary stressor or reason that they may have had that problem. Otherwise, I've seen animals that, they never got treatment, but they've got nasty wounds that they completely healed from, whether it's missing limbs or heavily scarred, missing chunks of carapace. And this is, they did just fine.
Right. It's really interesting. And when it comes to shell infections, I'm always curious how people treat them, because it seems like there's kind of a wide variety of information out there, and it's species specific maybe. But what are your thoughts on dry docking, and maybe what is your go-to regime for shell issues, fungus and such?
Yeah. One of, actually looking at just our gopher tortoises, there's a lot that still needs to be learned with a lot of, they have, the flaking and keratin issues with them. And that's something that we're actually just kind of embarking in on a new study right now, trying to figure out the cause of that, because some, they just like have nothing left. They're just complete, white, flaky, carapace, top and bottom, just there, it's all over. But then, we have some that's small spots. But if I get, actually just recently I had someone, this was a captive issue. They found the turtle in the wild, decided to keep it as a pet for 11 years, but it had retained scutes. So when you pull it off, you can see that, there's obviously shell rot underneath. So basically my first protocol is to, get the area cleaned up, and I'll usually use like a chlorhexidine based solution, which is also really good for, killing off fungus as well as other, bacterium and stuff. So we get that all scrubbed and cleaned up from there. Then I dry dock. I want the wound to just really dry out so that I can kind of see it and see if it starts to flake or decay even further. And then I'll either, I like honey products. I feel like honey products have a really large range of benefits for the reptiles and are very safe. And so you can't like overdose honey. It's like you can put as much or as little, whatever, and you can't go wrong with it. But it has a lot of benefits to it. And with the healing process, I feel like it does really well. So I'll use usually topical like Manuka honey or medical grade honey products on those wounds. But then I also treat with an antibiotic. And usually I go with like ceftazidime or Fortaz, as people will know it as. And that is a great broad spectrum that is safe and can be used more long term. Because the biggest thing with reptiles is because it's such a slower process with their healing, you kind of have to stick with it for a while. And if you're using a drug that, like, Natrol was a go-to for the longest time, but it's actually shown to cause renal issues in reptiles, especially if they're not well enough hydrated. Even then, it can have negative effects. So we try not to use Natrol at all. Ever, unless extremely necessary. But the Fortaz is great. You can use it long term, and it doesn't have as much effects, and it's very effective in working together with our honey products. So with the shell rot, I would definitely dry dock for, usually I try to do 24 hours, on and off. So 24 hours up, 24 hours back in the water, get back to your natural environment, and then come back out and then do the treatment again. And I've had a lot of success with that. It's just, it takes time.
Interesting. For the chlorhexidine, is that diluted? It's not.
Yeah, I'll usually dilute it. Sometimes I'll go 50-50, especially when I first take, especially when you're removing the keratin layer off, and it just smells so bad. Like, it's like, okay, there's stuff going on here. So I usually give it a good strong cleanse, at least on the first one. But thereafter, you can use just some sterile water to kind of just rinse and cleanse the area beforehand. And then, or just a mild chlorhexidine just to cleanse it, dry it, and then you can add, what you're going to use on top with that.
It's interesting. It seems like for a lot of that, there's a standard protocol, but a lot of people have different variations on how they do it.
Yeah, and I mean, and that there's not always just one. It depends on the severity. You can have a tiny little minor case where you just use a little topical cream, you dry dock them for a couple days, like because it's just getting started, and some husbandry changes, and there you go. You don't have to go crazy. But I think once you start seeing that the decay of the shell and that it's getting close to the bloodstream, you want to avoid any kind of septicemia starting from it. So that's when I will start the antibiotics, as if it looks like it's getting that deep into the body that we need to be worried about that. Obviously, it's just a little flaky something, I won't worry about it so much. But anything that goes deeper.
Do you have any examples of like a particularly crazy case that you thought there's no way in hell this turtle is going to survive or something like that, and it just pulls through like miraculously?
Yeah, I've definitely had a few that have surprised me. I had a snapping turtle that actually had a spinal injury, which, they don't always end up with spinal injuries because of their structure and everything. Their vertebrae is set actually slightly down. And of course, if you look at any of the bones and the bone structure, that's kind of a benefit. So it gives them a little bit of a buffer when they're hit by a car. But I had one that did have a slight deviation there, and she wasn't using her back legs very well. And it was kind of a mild spinal injury. And I actually almost just deemed her. I was like, you're going to be a non-releasable. I'm going to have to kind of decide what I want to do. I don't know that I want to euthanize you. I've kind of grown attached, but, you want to give them a chance. And so I was like, let me give it another month or so. I was like, let's increase your food intake and some vitamins. Let's just give you a little more time. And I couldn't believe it. It's like all of a sudden she started using the back legs. And I was like, oh my gosh, like, I'm so glad I gave you more time, because I really thought this is it. And sure enough, she pulled through, and I ended up releasing her. So, that was one that I wasn't sure. And then I had a gopher tortoise that literally, like, the whole hip, almost pelvic side of the carapace was completely shattered and missing. And the whole membrane, everything was all exposed, and it looked really bad. But after about 4 months, I think it took about 4 months of care and healing, and it scarred up and firmed up really well. And I was actually able to release that one back to her burrow. So again, another one that I was like, I don't know if I was going to make it. I was missing a pretty good portion. But she did good too. So yeah, there's definitely some that have surprised me.
Have you ever seen, this is something I read a while back, they talk about soft shell turtles will sometimes get a hind limb paralysis that isn't due to anything traceable. Have you ever seen that?
Yeah, I got one right now. Well, I wouldn't say it wouldn't be from something traceable. It was definitely hit by a car, but on x-ray, there's no issue with the spine at all. Like, and sometimes with these guys, it's hard to see those details on x-ray. It's almost like you really need like a CT scan to really look at maybe slight little deviations, because all it takes is, and this is something with especially younger gopher tortoises, they have a slight squish to them. So like a dog will come up and they, boop, a little bit, and on the back, right over the spine, and it pops back up. So it looks visually normal, but the damage is already done to the spinal cord. So then they're paralyzed, and they're like, I don't know, there's not a scratch on this animal, but they're paralyzed. So I think sometimes these little tiny micro fractures and disruptions to the spinal cord do happen during trauma that may not be really visual. And then you end up, with a spinal injury. And it's pretty incredible. I've seen some that, I'm like, there's no way you should have a spinal injury, and they do. And then there's some that I'm like, oh my gosh, that's got to be a spinal injury, and it doesn't. So it just really depends on how they're hit and how it affects the spinal cord, how well it was protected by the vertebrae. But I like I said, I have a case now that was hit by a car, but nothing visually looks like it should be impaired, and I don't know why he won't use his back legs. I'm still baffled. I'm giving him time, but yeah.
It's interesting. Like you said, the soft shells in particular, that structural flexibility, maybe it more of the time it doesn't look like there's an issue when there actually has been.
Yeah, yeah, and I've had some that I'll necropsy even afterwards, just because I'm curious at what happens, and there's just certain things that are going on in there that you just don't see in these guys. With mammals, you can almost like palpate and say, oh yeah, I feel this is swollen or this is broken. You can't do that. They got a whole shell on the outside, so things that could be happening in there you just can't see without. Like I said, X-rays are very beneficial, but they're also not 100%. Um, because sometimes the damage is done, but you just can't see it there. It's too small to actually view.
What's the most unusual case that you've seen?
I think one of the ones that had actually kind of hit the news pretty big was a gopher tortoise that was completely painted red. I don't know if you heard about that. His name was Raphael, but the guy dumped paint down a burrow to dispose of it improperly. He claims he didn't know that it was a gopher tortoise burrow, but I'm like, okay, so you just chose a hole in the ground to spill paint down, okay, and some concrete and stuff as well. So this poor animal was like covered in red from head to toe, skin, like everything. It was wild. So that was probably one of the most extreme and unusual cases I had. And then I think another one was a little more recent that was shot with lead pellets. That was a gopher tortoise, and unfortunately, it was lead poisoning that led to that one's decline, even though we were able to manage the wounds. So that was a very frustrating case. But yeah, I think those are two that kind of stand out, at least right away.
Right. Something I'm curious about too. This is kind of you touched on this really early on, because you see, and even then with the paint and such. I mean, that's kind of a form of. I mean, it is a form of abuse in a way. Is that something like? Are you seeing a lot of these? I think some of those cases can be tough to talk about, but it's good to cover it. Like kind of horrific situations that it's just like, why would someone do this? And is that something that's really a prevalent issue?
Yeah, no, it is. It is. I think animal cruelty in general is an issue probably across the board with, all kinds of species at all different levels. But I feel like it's not taken as seriously in the reptile world. And that's something that really bothers me because it's just so cold hearted. I had a common snapping turtle come in this past year, early in this year, and she basically, the neighbor witnessed the guy basically taking a 2x4 and smashing in this female who was probably out nesting because it was late February when she came in, and it was just so bothersome. I mean, she was so busted up. I mean, she did make it. I saved her. She ended up going back, but I'm just like, why? Why did you take that time to go out and do that to this animal? I'm like, she's just passing through between 2 yards, but this guy decided that he needed to take a 2x4 to it. I'm like, yeah. I've had gopher tortoises come in that kids were spinning around or kicking around in a street. It's stuff that it is. It's really bothersome. It's like it's unnecessary cruelty and being shot. Shooting at them like targets. I think they think it's just going to bounce off of them. I think a lot of people think that the turtle, because they have a shell, that it's indestructible. And I'm like, that's not the case. They are still vulnerable to deep impacts, and bullets.
Right. Yeah, it's unfortunate that some people feel like they need to use animals like that. I don't understand it, but it's good that people like yourself are spending so much time fixing those situations. When it comes to fixing the situation with a lot of things, I'm sure it varies case by case, but what's the prognosis that an animal is going to be released back into the wild? What's the likelihood of that?
We usually run. We have a nice little program that I put in whether or not the animal has made it and all of their records and everything, and you can tally up what kind of your percentage success rate and things are. And usually we run around the 75 to 80% release rate, and which is really good. I know especially like in the avian world and rehab, birds, they're so sensitive and stuff. They're like constant. They're lucky if they're at 30, 40%, it seems. But yeah, I think I think it's also because I have focused just on reptiles. I think that's also why we're probably a little bit a better success rate, because it's basically all I do. I don't have to worry about feeding little baby squirrels in between care and and things like that. It's like a nice focus. And I think that's what's really important about this is it is something to be completely involved in to have a better success rate in these animals.
Right. When it comes to something that's kind of hit the news recently, and it is the Fraser virus and in Florida, and some of I'm at because you're going out and all the time getting case reports and actually going on site and seeing the situation with that Fraser virus. Maybe what are your thoughts on that? And then are there any other interesting trends you've noted just from going out and seeing things in the field that are concerning or maybe that people should know about?
Yeah. So with the TFV, I've been working on it with kind of as a collaboration with some of the FWC health team for several years now. And it's definitely, it's a concern. It's definitely a concern. We went to one site where the die-up had happened, I guess, several months before. And they had, it was at least, I would say 50, just they're all sun bleached because it had been some time. There's about 50, cooters that were all lined up along the bank. So you can see that it definitely hit hard. And that's just what they were finding, on this particular property. The woman had reported it. And unfortunately, there wasn't enough for us to test. There's nothing intact enough to send off for that particular case. But later on down the road, knowing that area was a hot spot, I actually received a soft-shell turtle from there, and from a very close by, similar area, and that one did test positive for it. So then we're able to confirm that virus is within that lake or water system, and so that was definitely something that was eye-opening at what mass mortality could happen from this virus, and how much we don't really know about it, especially how does it go from one turtle to the other, I think is our biggest question. Like, how are they contracting it or giving it? Who's it coming from? All of those things. So that's part of the biggest part of the study. But I think the most disheartening part is that with soft shells, it actually kills them pretty quickly. So if they're going to go down from Fraser virus, they still have a decent body weight to them. So it doesn't look like they have any reason to have died. They don't look emaciated. They just, they may actually have some skin lesions and look a little fungusy. But, maybe their eyes are swollen and stuff, but they don't have any apparent injury, good body weight. So it seems to affect them very quickly, and then they die pretty quickly from it. Whereas the cooters and even sliders, because we've had red ear sliders were also affected in a lot of these groups. They're completely emaciated. You can tell they have been sitting there suffering from this virus probably for 6+ months as they just slowly waste away. And it's just unless something happens like predation, and that's something that I look for. If there's an animal that's sitting on a bank and you can tell that a leg or something was being messed with like a raccoon or other predator, I'm like, get them in here, because there's a good chance that it's the reason why they were more vulnerable, because they were sick and sitting on a bank. So, and we have discovered the virus in some of them because of that. You just look at, it's secondary to the initial factor, which was that they were sick and ill. That's why they didn't run to the water when approached, so it makes them vulnerable. But yeah, it's definitely the neurological signs. It's awful. It's awful to watch. It's really sad. It's really sad. Spinning in circles, flipping their bodies around. It's not pretty.
But there's research ongoing now with it, and potentially a lot of information coming out in the future.
Yes. Yeah. There's mainly the biggest studies were kind of looking at areas, and then one of the studies that I was kind of running in-house is I have one now too that's a positive case, and we've tried some different trials with maybe trying a couple different drugs or that we can antivirals to see if we can knock it down, and then or overall care and their shedding of the virus. So we'll do cloacal swabs every couple weeks and then see, does it go up? Does it go down? Does it go away? And we did have one case where she tested positive for 4 months straight. And it was not positive. She tested negative for 4 months straight after being positive for at least, I don't know, I say 8 to 10 months. It was like consistently positive, and then boom, stopped being positive. And so she stayed negative for a good, her body weight came back, and that was all based on supportive care and just trying to keep her at an optimal, husbandry, and she did well. But then we've had others that it's like once it starts affecting their brain, because it can cause like the swelling of the brain, and so they have neurological issues. So once that starts to kick in, there's pretty much no going back. I think if you catch it early enough on and give them good supportive care, they have a chance. But other than that, I think they're too far gone most of the time once you find them. But that's where we're trying to kind of look at the effects and how long, carriers. So then are they just carriers after? Does it come back during stress? Those are all a lot of questions we still have.
Right. It's like one thing to think about bacterial dynamics, like an actual organism circulating, but then viral dynamics when you actually get to, well, I don't know. I mean, does anyone know what type? Because there's so many different types of, it could be RNA virus, double-stranded, any type of, there's so many viral types. Is anything known about that, or?
That one, I usually leave that to the vet for those more, more precise. I think if I remember correctly, they were talking about that the structure is actually quite vulnerable, so it wouldn't live very long. Like extreme, even when we're doing the swabs, let's say extreme heat or any kind of warm temperatures for prolonged time can definitely, you won't get a good sample. Those samples have to be like frozen as fast as possible to secure that. So I think that the virus has a vulnerability to it, but that's not a virologist. So right. I do more of the lab part, the lab and the care.
Yeah, right. That's a whole different area. And
yeah.
But yeah, that's interesting. Is that so? That's the primary issue now. Are you seeing any other concerning trends when you go out on call, or is that the main thing?
No, there is still some. And one of the other things I have noticed is because, like I said, I've done a lot of the necropsies on the TFV, or those that are potential TFV that we're waiting on results and such for. But it does seem to affect, especially with the females, the reproductive organs. So that is kind of concerning, getting egg bound and having masses and lots of plaques all over in the body cavity and on the organs. I think, and I don't know, some of that may also roll over to other viruses. So like ranavirus is a big concern. That's something that's kind of, most people know about that. We know that can cause mass mortality events, with snakes, frogs, turtles, fish, so that's one, and that's always a concern. So anytime we see something that's sick, we always look at ranavirus could be a cause, not necessarily just TFV. But a lot of these areas are, well, actually, I can tell you about one story about with TFV and also how it could be spreading. I can tell you that one, so I'll give you that story. So we were at a site and conducting, samplings and trapping. And we ended up with a red belly cooter, and the red belly cooter had a microchip. And we're like, oh, okay, whose microchip is this? So we actually contacted Turtle Survival Alliance, because we know that they also microchip in some of the areas around Central Florida. Usually it's the spring systems and stuff. So like Wakaiva and such. So come to find out, it was one of their numbers. And it ended up being a turtle that they hadn't seen in years. Like it was consistently showing up. They were collecting data on it. Everything was great with this animal. And then all of a sudden, it just dropped off the face of the earth. They never trapped it again for years. And it showed up 86 miles away. So over in Lakeland, where we were sampling, this animal turned up, and where they were sampling it from was over at Wakaiva. So in Wakaiva Springs.
Wow.
And there's no natural waterway for this animal to have naturally gone and moved there. So basically the only thing I could come to the conclusion is someone was probably visiting Wakaiva, and she may have went out to go lay eggs And of course, then if she's around no water and someone felt bad, like, well, there's no water anywhere, I'm going to take her back to my lake where, near my apartment complex here in Lakeland. And then they dumped her into a lake, which was, TFV positive. So she became sick and she actually died. But what we did learn is that, people can move this virus very quickly by trying to do the right thing. They think they're trying to help them, they're trying to save them, but all they're doing is basically transporting, viruses, diseases around, and not just TFV, but, rhinovirus and herpes or mycoplasmas and gopher tortoises. It's like, so I guess my point is that the movement of that people, when people trying to move these animals around is actually, spreading it much faster than it would have naturally.
Right. That's a really interesting story. I was going to say, like, that's the migratory record, the turtle that went from Santa Fe all the way to the mouth of the Suwannee and back. It's like, but you couldn't do that in an interior situation like that. Yeah, right. It it wasn't a natural movement.
Yeah.
That would be more impressive over land, but that's, that definitely human induced. So it's really interesting. And a good example of, like, when you add invasives to that and introduce species, how does that complicate things? I mean, maybe sliders, I don't know. This is speculation. It's obviously no one's looked. I don't know if anyone's looked at this, but if you've got a non-native species that is a better at transmitting it, or in some situation like that, it could be even worse. You think about disease transmission from non-natives, that could be an issue.
Yeah. And I mean, and again, this is still kind of new in the study, but in the one particular area, because it was very urbanized, lots of homes and stuff, you can tell people had dumped their red ear sliders and yellow bellies and stuff from the pet trade into this particular lake. So it was definitely not their natural range. But it did seem that the resilience of the sliders, that they tested positive, but they had good body weight. They were functioning individuals, no signs or symptoms of the virus, but yet they swabbed positive. And a lot of those were sliders. So their ability to maybe handle it is better, which at the same time as being an invasive or introduced species, not so good, because, it's killing our natives, but yet, the invasives are tolerating it. So that is a concern, for sure, along those lines. And not that we had red ear sliders that were completely emaciated and did die from it, especially like older individuals. You can tell they had been around for a while. So maybe that played a role in it, but we definitely swabbed a lot of them that swabbed positive, but had no signs or symptoms, good body weight. Right.
Talking about something kind of changing the topic just a bit, some of the technology that you bring to the table is really cool, especially like how we all met at the Santa Fe River Turtle Project and such. And I just remember the first time, I don't know when it was, but just seeing the portable X-ray and the ultrasound and everything was really cool. And we've talked about it a lot, like just the amount of data that you can now get with those tools. Like it's a really important thing, super integral. It's great that you're involved with it. I'm just curious, what kind of insights have you gained from having access to different pieces of technology? What's it like to kind of the upkeep of a lot of those things?
Yeah, it's definitely helpful. I can say, like when I first started, not having any of these tools, I feel a little spoiled now for sure. But, starting off in the beginning, with even the ultrasound, for example, was probably one of the biggest pieces of equipment that I got to start with. And the reason why we got it was because we were trying to find out if females, without having to take them to the vet clinic and wait for an x-ray to be done elsewhere, which took a lot of time and resources, we're like, well, we could just ultrasound and determine if they had eggs. And this way here, while they're in treatment, because that's a big thing, is if you got females who are full of eggs after they've been struck by a car, we need to know that, because that should be a part of their treatment plan. We need to be aware, do we need to get the eggs out? The sooner you get help those females get those eggs out, they can focus on healing. Otherwise, they can become egg bound if you're just oblivious to the fact that they've been in there for 6 months while they've been in care. We don't want that to happen. So, so the ultrasound was a huge game changer in that, and was the main reason why we got it, is so that we could just quickly, stick the probe there. It's like ultrasound, yes, no, and done. And that answered a lot of questions very quickly for us and to move forward. Then, of course, playing with it, looking for like bladder stones, then became something that was helpful. And then I also realized that, with reptiles, a lot of times they can look dead, but their heart is still going. And so then I also found that the ultrasound was very helpful in us identifying, without the Doppler, this was before I even had a Doppler, that I could actually see the movement of the heart and circulation through ultrasound. So we knew that the animal hadn't actually quite passed on yet. And so, between that and then getting the Doppler and actually being able to hear and listen for heart rate and heartbeat, to know if they're still alive and how they're doing, was another tool that was great. And then, of course, upgrading to X-ray was like the ultimate because, a lot of the local vet clinics were really great and trying to allow us to, use their X-ray machine and everything. But a lot of them didn't have a lot of knowledge in how to position those animals. And so a lot of times, or even settings. So a lot of times I would get these X-rays back that I'm like, oof, I really, it's almost like not useful. I can't really see what I need. So yeah, that helped kind of, it was great. I don't have to go anywhere. It's here. It's in-house. I get it done. I get the positions I need depending on, the situation and get it done, get the views done. But, and then of course, bringing it to Santa Fe opened up a whole another need for it, because now we could look at the follicles and the female's reproduction and monitoring all of that. And so then I was like, oh my gosh, this is so cool. This one simple piece of equipment can do so many things. And then of course, having X-ray to be able to count how many eggs they have, if they have eggs, or fish hooks, looking over if they have any foreign objects that they've swallowed, what they've been eating, it's just like, it's really cool. It's really cool, and it's really helpful. And I think it's definitely opened up even more doors to get more information, more data from all of these research projects.
Yeah, it's exciting to see. I mean, it just years from now how that data is going to be used, and it's just like a completely different thing. You also have some blood samples, that sort of thing. And I know Wyatt was talking about this. Maybe he can go into that a bit more too, but just like tests and such. What's your process for that? Like, you get a blood sample and then what happens with it?
Yeah, so just like with people and cats, dogs, you can get your CBC, your PCV, and then of course your blood chemistry. So your doctor usually says, once a year, every couple of years, you should get that done to make sure everything's good and healthy and that you're functioning okay. So the same thing is happening with them. So I have a centrifuge, which helps spin down the little microhemocrit vials, and then I can do PCVs. And then, then I also have the blood chem machine, and that helps give a chemistry profile of that animal so that we can look at their overall health. And then, of course, making the slides is for our CBC so that you can get that cell, look at the cells and the blood, and making sure things are normal and well-formed, and that there's not too many of one thing or versus another. And so that's all of that helps with the diagnostics of understanding these animals. The biggest thing with it is that there's not a whole lot known, and documented in reptiles to reference. So that's our biggest hurdle is referencing a lot of that. So a lot of this is kind of embarking on a new findings and, hey, is this normal or no? And that's I think the hardest part, but it's definitely teaching us a lot. We're collecting a lot of information to actually create baselines, data for future stuff.
Right. It's like we've had some research vets on in the past, and a lot of, like, if it has anything to do with the hematology, the publication will just be essentially, it's enough to publish just a sample from one, or a small amount of individuals, preferably, or a large amount. most preferably, but not realistic a lot of the time. But just that in itself is enough for baseline material, right? Like you're saying, there's just nothing known.
Yeah, and a lot of times they are from captive situations, and like in one reference, they use red ear sliders as a common blood panel or reference level profile that we used for cooters. But that doesn't necessarily mean that would be the same. It's kind of hard to say that that's a proper matchup. Maybe close, but maybe not necessarily. We could be missing things, because we're doing that. Same goes for our desert tortoises and using that as a reference for gopher tortoises. There's definitely a different environment. It's not large change, but there's differences, and where they're living and their environments and what they might be able to handle differently. And I think that's something that, we need to look at deeper, is having more specific profiles from wild, not just like, captive environments, because I think it'd be different.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so the lead testing and some of the heavy metal testing, I seem to recall that's an in the field test, which is fascinating to me. Maybe you could talk about that a little, and why is that important? Why is it important to test for those things?
Yeah, so lead is something that that research project kind of got sparked from looking at mainly, birds ending up with lead toxicosis and lead poisoning. And so I was like, well, has that, go reflect on reptiles? Has anyone looked at lead or heavy metals in reptiles and how it may affect them? Because in a lot of cases that we get where we get sick reptiles in, a lot of times we don't end up with an answer. We could test from, head to toe, and we're like, what happened to this animal? What are we missing? What are we not testing? And so I just kind of had to, sometimes I go with my gut a lot on things. And I was like, I really want to look at lead in our across all Florida species of chelonians. I want to do all of them, as many as I can, and we get so many animals in that it's like the perfect resource, because we cover many counties and we get lots of different species and a lot of them every year. So even just testing just them without using any field animals would be a lot of data. So that's how it started. And we discovered that, and this project's almost done. I'm going to try to wrap it up after 2 years of testing. It's going to be probably about 800 individuals when I'm done will be tested for lead. But some of the discoveries already have been really fascinating, and that it's gopher tortoises are basically the ones that are most susceptible to the lead and having the highest buildup or concentration in their blood. And that's something that, it's an infield test that I can take with me, which is great. It runs on batteries. It's a lead care tube. They use it in people, they use it in farm animals, and you get a result in 3 minutes. So it makes it much easier to do on the go.
Yeah, it's really cool. With the study, I don't know, like if this is not something that is, like, you're obviously in the process of doing it, so maybe this data is forthcoming. But is there anything negative associated with higher concentrations of lead and other issues, or is that more unknown? Because those correlations, I guess it's a situation where the correlation is not necessarily causation of something, could factor into it, but is there any indication you have that there could be some negative effects?
Yes, so far, and I think with this has basically opened up doors of where we need to go and dive deeper in certain things. And one of the things that I'm starting to dive deeper into is, especially now that we know, it's like, okay, we're looking at gopher tortoises are the ones that seem to have the biggest issue with it, or are more common to have it. And then how is that affecting them? And one thing that I have noticed is that we've had cases of metabolic bone disease, which is not typically something you find in a wild reptile, but in gopher tortoises, and they're younger animals. So, they're probably about the size of your hand. They're, juveniles, subadults, and they're soft. And, you can tell that their body weight isn't very good. Their skin is just awful. And it's like, okay, their overall health is very poor, and they're testing positive for lead. So when you look at lead actually can bind or replace calcium. So if these animals are subjected to, even if it seems like lower amounts of lead early on, it's like, could this be leading to calcium deficiencies or other, deficiencies overall with them? And it can shorten their lifespan. It could be also making them more vulnerable to predation, because obviously if they're softer or weaker, then they're more vulnerable to being picked off. So that's something that we're looking more into. Also, growth rate is something I've noticed. We had a lead positive site where, like 95% of the tortoises were positive. And I just noticed that they were, some of these animals had to be well over 30 years old, but they were like the size of small males. And they were, females, obviously females, but it should have been bigger. And so that's something else that I'm wondering is if, prolonged exposure may reduce growth rates. Again, this is stuff that we're still looking more into, but the overall lead study in the beginning is what allowed me to see that we need to take this path and look deeper into that. So that's something we definitely want to look at. And of course, their immune systems and their vulnerability to fight disease is another one that we're looking into. So if they're mycoplasma positive, is it, reducing their ability to fight that when they would have otherwise because they have, lead in their systems? So those are all questions that we're trying to answer.
Right. That's fascinating. That last one, the immune system function, is probably kind of tough to get at, right? Is there really a good metric?
You kind of dropped out there, but
is there a good metric for measuring immune system function holistically?
We do, when we do the blood work, we can kind of see if, how their overall health is and kind of base it off that. But I don't know that there is a metric that we can necessarily, other than overall, like, body conditions and stuff like that. But that's going to be a tougher one to look at. So we can kind of only assume. But, we can look at birds and people, even how lead affects people or other heavy metals affect people. And a part of that is a known fact of immune system and calcium, all of that is affected. So
right.
Just based on that, I think we can, safely assume that there could be could be affecting them.
It's really interesting, exciting. And so there's one more thing I'm curious about before we kind of wrap things down with some final questions and kind of wrap up. But you mentioned early on the salvaging turtle eggs. I'm curious what that process is like. That's got to be interesting. Like, how do you effectively do that?
Yeah, it's actually, it's fairly easy. I know right away you're like, okay, there's a shell there, but basically in that pelvic space, you can usually get in without having to cut into the animal at all. So you don't need saws or anything. And honestly, soft shells and snapping turtles are probably the easiest because they have that reduced plastron. So it's like everything's very accessible. But yeah, I think the hardest ones to get eggs out of are probably gopher tortoises because there is far smaller space to work with them getting into that pelvic area. But and their eggs are just so big. So a lot of times I have to cut or notch out a part of their plastron so that I can open that space for me to get them out. But yeah, hundreds of eggs are pulled from females of various species every year. This year we had, I think, well over 200 hatch out between, and that even includes a couple snakes this year. We actually had females that we salvaged snake eggs that were successful, which was really exciting. But yeah, we had a couple hundred easy that are saved in various species from that. So
that's exciting stuff. Also, when you take into consideration like you've got a high success rate for release, but then you're actually probably doing more. Your overall replacement rate is maybe higher than 100% total when you factor in that, or is that's probably not factored in, I assume, the hatchlings.
Yeah, no, I really never thought of it that way. I've just kind of figured, we're helping, preserve the species. We're doing basically what the mother didn't get a chance to finish doing. And if we can, a lot of times we save the mom, and the mom goes back and then the babies hatch and then the babies go back. So yeah, definitely, I guess it does increase the overall.
Definitely.
So that's one way of
Yeah.
looking at it.
That's cool. Well, there's I'm curious just for some closing questions and um, in terms of adventures, right? Because we've talked a lot about the rehabilitation and stories from that, but you've also done there's a lot on YouTube and such, and we'll link all of that in the description so people can see. But in terms of your adventures, what's the most memorable adventure you have or something particularly interesting?
Well, I think when it came to filming, there was a couple, because that was like when Swamp Girl Adventures kind of started with the educational videos on YouTube. That was back 2009 as our first ones. So I think one of the most memorable was, first of all, filming the intro to it, because we were over at Shingle Creek, and I was holding a camera and I was wearing the boots, and I didn't take into account the depth of water or the fact that there was a current. So I was trying to manage a camera, jump in water, and swim, and it wasn't working very well.
Yeah.
I almost kind of needed a rescue. So that was an adventure there in itself with filming that first part. But I think one of the most memorable moments is when Gus One Bear, he was from the TV show Swamp Men, he invited us to go to South Florida, and we had caught gar and went on hikes with him and everything, and looking at the Everglades. And we also caught some iguanas and such over in Miami. So that was, I think, the Everglades section of it was really cool. We visited the Skunk Ape Research Center down there. They let us stay down there and do that video. So it was like, I think that was probably one of the most memorable video adventures that I have there. That, and then of course the water snakes. I love water snakes. So I love all my water snake videos. I'll play with water snakes all day long.
Yeah, Nerodia, they're adorable. They're such
They're
species.
they're the best. Like, I think my dream enclosure will be a walk-in water snake where you can just, like, it's a full-on pond, and I'm just gonna come in there with little fish and just have them like swim up onto my lap and hand feed them. Like, that's my dream. That's it. Yeah. That's what I want to do.
Nice.
That would be epic. People do that.
That's cool. Yeah. In terms of your like most interesting find, I mean, is there anything that stands out for something that was the most meaningful find that you've seen, like reptile, amphibian wise?
Oh gosh. I think finding a pine snake down a gopher tortoise burrow was pretty exciting. You know, you don't get to see pine snakes very often. So that was one that I can definitely say was on top notch list there. I can definitely say that seeing the alligator snapping turtles, which I can thank Jeff for catching that one, so I could see one in person. Like, my whole life, even in third grade, I did like a whole book report on alligator snapping turtles. Like, that was, I wanted to see them so bad in the wild. Yeah. And you know, I seen them in captivity, worked with them in captivity, but in actual wild was just like, that was epic. That was awesome.
Well, now you're always out there with Kevin and Travis and too as well. So
yeah,
you've seen more than most people.
And I've taken their blood and done X-rays, so I'm like, yeah, I'm 100% worth the wait.
Oh yeah, that's awesome.
So just some basic for people, if someone finds a sick or injured turtle or tortoise or reptile or amphibian in general, what are the good steps for them to take?
Yeah, so the best advice is, I always tell people, is no food and water. Everybody wants to feed it. And I always say, I'm like, okay, if your arm got chopped off and you're on the way to the emergency room, are you stopping at McDonald's? No. You know, like, this is not the time that you're thinking about food. Yeah. So I'm like, no food, no water. All it does is attract flies to the wound. And then, of course, then they're scuffling through it, and I'm cleaning lettuce out of a wound. I'm like, just, yeah. So I'm like, no food or water. Get them into a dark box or bin so that they're well contained. And obviously, you know, don't let your kids play with them. Don't let them hang out with your dogs. You know, they're not pets. Keep them quiet and secure until you can find help. One of the other biggest things that, I don't know where this is on the internet, and it needs to be taken off, but don't pour peroxide in the wounds. So I'm like, these animals, they have open lung, and also, and they're just like, yeah, I cleaned it out with peroxide. I read it on the internet. And I'm like, okay, that site needs to be taken down. Don't do that. I'd rather they don't do anything at all. Let the body clot, let the animal rest. Disturbing them and cleaning wounds and trying to do more, it can be more harmful than good. So my best advice is just keep them calm, get them secure, and get them to help as soon as possible. If for some reason they feel like they need to add something, raw honey is safe to use on a wound, especially if they're worried about flies. If it's been like 24 hours before they found help and they're like, I got to put something on it. But definitely stay away from, things that are like Neosporin. It just never cleans off right. I can't do the repairs properly on their shell with it. It's madness. So I'm like, please don't put Neosporin or anything on there. But yeah, I think, and then of course, don't put them with your collection. I had somebody who had a lethargic turtle literally put it with their pet turtle on the back porch. Like, oh yeah, I let them hang out together until I found help. And I'm like, why would you do that? This is a sick animal. Now your animal has the potential of being sick, or maybe vice versa, who knows? So that's another thing I always say is, keep them separate, keep them quiet, and look for help immediately. Don't wait. Don't wait.
That's cool. It's a lot of nuance to, like, the Neosporin thing is great. That's like something that's specific that I could see a lot of people making that mistake. It's good to hear from your perspective.
The peroxide sticks out to me though. Like I use that to dissolve flesh off of carcasses and stuff like that. I mean, I wouldn't put that in an open wound of like something that where it could cause serious. I could see somebody, oh, maybe we'll clean out a little wound, but if the body cavity's open, it's like I'm not going to pour peroxide in there. That's like a terrible idea.
Yeah, and I've had it happen. I've had the animals, and most of the time, either the wound doesn't heal well or they die. You know, especially if it's a major wound. If it's just a scuff, it's like, all right, that wasn't necessary, but it turn out well when they do that.
I agree.
So you have an initiative, the Rescue, Rehabilitation, Research, Conservation of Reptiles and Amphibians. Maybe you can just talk about that a little, and for people interested, what is that exactly, and how can people get involved with supporting it?
Yeah, so we basically, the RECORA project, so that all stands, we say RECORA to summarize all of that, but basically that project was started jointly with Swamp Girl Adventures, because the Swamp Girl Adventures is a registered nonprofit. So this is just a project thereof. So our education and everything is through Swamp Girl Adventures. But then the blood, sweat, and tears, as I call it, and all that hard work is part of the RECORA project. And that's where we are doing those rescues, the rehabilitation, and the research and conservation efforts for the reptiles and amphibians. So we got RECORA. And we launched the RECORA fundraiser and project in 2020, January of 2020 at that. And obviously everyone knows that soon after we had COVID. So it was a very slow start to fundraising to build a facility. So the goal of it is to raise enough money to actually have a property where we can have a facility, where we could even allow underprivileged children to come and help and volunteer, give them a resource. But then also college students who might be interested in veterinary rehab, reptiles at all, and anything, any study that might be appropriate, and give them an option to actually work more hands-on. Because I know that's something that isn't really out there as a resource. Most wildlife rehabbers who have internships, they're working with birds and small mammals. But if you have someone who's interested in reptiles, it's like, where do you go? Who do you work with? So we would also like to have more of those options, maybe even green volunteer, where people from other states or countries might want to come help and visit an internship on short-term periods is another thing we've looked at and want to offer. But all in all, I'm really what I envision is that it would be a place that can also be all inclusive to whether FWC is passing through and they're working on a die-off and they need a stop through or a lab to use or something, it's like we're a resource. Other researchers who might be working in the area, can we be a resource? Does a veterinarian or wildlife of a specific type need a surgical procedure? We can be a resource. So I want it to be that hub for reptiles, and maybe even triage of other animals and birds too, to help get them triaged and then to appropriate people. But that is the whole goal and picture of it. And So what we really need is property that isn't millions of dollars in cost. Right now, land values in Florida are like up there. And then, of course, from there, we can start building on everything else that will come with it.
It's really cool. That's like it's all sort of all the stuff that you're doing. It makes this huge centralized home base that would be, and it's centrally located in Florida, right? It would be in the Orlando area. Is that right?
Yeah. So we're like dead center in the state, and I've discussed this with a lot of people. They're like, "Oh, why don't you just come over here? Come to this side of the state. Come to North Florida. Go to South Florida." I'm like, as soon as I do that, I feel like I'm literally leaving where the need is. It is so centralized. It allows us to cover a very large scope in a very large area. And it even helps with me traveling. I mean, I can travel to Santa Fe in a couple hours, just like I can travel to South Florida within a couple hours. So it's really hard to shift out of that because I feel like we are right there in the middle and could be far more helpful if we stay in this area than if we shifted to another part of the state. So.
Just out of like curiosity, how many animals do you have with you, like, and live ones at any given time? Like,
oh gosh. So during busy season, I've had well over 100 in care. And then we do have our resident animals and everything too. So, that's give or take about 30 animals. But yeah, with the rehab, we have had during peak seasons, I can have this a lot.
yeah.
During slow time, like right now, I think I'm at about 40. I have about 40 in care. So this is a little bit slower during the winter because the animals aren't as active. But we'll have a peak of warm weather and suddenly the tortoises are moving, getting hit by cars. Females decide now it's time for the fall winter lay. And then, I'll get 4 or 5 cooters in one day that have been hit that are out trying to lay eggs. So it can suddenly go crazy.
Yeah.
I'm curious, for going back to it's Cora, the initiative, like at a global scale, like why should people care about turtles, reptiles? What is it that's like, if you had to explain it to someone who doesn't know anything about them, kind of like we all have the moral imperative part of it, but is there something else, or is that it? I mean, I think that there's so many different answers to this. I'm curious what your take on it is.
Yeah. I think what I always say in general, even with the education part, is that my goal is not to necessarily make you say love a snake, right? But if you respect that they have a place in our world and the environment and our ecosystem, that's all I ask. I'm not saying that you need to keep one as a pet. I'm not saying you need to go cuddle with everyone that you see. And I think the same applies to any of the reptiles, is even if you don't think that turtles matter, in your own personal world, but as a whole, they do. And even with amphibians being an indicator species of our overall health as people. So even if you don't care about those animals, but you care about your children or your overall health, by looking at these effects on these reptiles, we're also learning about our own environment and environmental impacts and how it will also impact us. I mean, by looking at lead levels in these animals also impacts how much heavy metals are we basically living in? What are we sitting in? So those studies and caring for these animals, I think, has an overall importance just for that alone.
Right. I think that's a really interesting point. It's it's an interesting perspective. Sort of going into, well, I've got one quick question too. Like talking about the amount of animals you're caring for at any given time, you've got to have some pretty impressive time management skills. Like, how do you manage time between all of those things? What's your strategy for that?
Who sleeps? That's I think, unfortunately, I think it comes down to sacrifice. There's a lot of family things. The fact that I'm actually been able to travel, I think, is only because both my daughters are old enough to take care of themselves and they're kind of doing their own thing now. It was much harder to travel when they were younger and just take off and go places. But, but even with the animals in rehab, it's hard to just go anywhere, But yeah, when it comes to time management, it's really hard. And especially because I can literally wake up and have a whole plan for what my day is going to be. and then it's emergency call, emergency call, emergency call, and then they're coming in. I'm going there. I'm investigating a site because there's and my whole plan for the day is gone. Like that's it. It just doesn't happen. So I think it's really hard to say that there's a time management. I think I just have to always prepare myself to be along for the ride. Because the more I resist, the worse it gets.
Right.
But yeah, that's the hardest part, is that you don't know what every day holds. I don't know when I'm going to get that call at 11 o'clock at night with someone saying, I got a turtle that was hit by a car,
Right. Yeah, it's a testament to your dedication to it and passion for it. You can't be in that sort of emergency capacity if you're not completely devoted to it. So it's a cool thing. So just to close this up, we'd like to ask the same question, but I'm curious if you had one piece of advice for someone looking to make turtle work, research, or education, rehabilitation, all the different stuff, part of a career, what would that be?
I think you would probably really want to look at what matters the most. I think a lot of people will get into something because maybe they have an interest in it, but then there's always the financial end. So I think that's probably the hardest part, is saying, what is my passion? And then how much is it going to help me, pay my bills and the rest of my future? And I don't know. I think it's really per each individual. I definitely didn't take the route of financial stability by becoming a wildlife rehabilitator, but at the same time, I also feel like I'm fulfilling a need that otherwise wouldn't be fulfilled for hundreds of animals a year. So I think it really comes down to choosing to follow your passion and what really makes you feel like you've done what you want with your life. And I know those aren't always easy decisions to make, but I think dabbling in all different avenues, you may actually find that you have a stronger interest in one direction than the other. Don't just have a narrow scope of, I just want to work with one species of turtle. It's like, get out there and, find different organizations like Santa Fe that you can volunteer with, and just get those experiences and really just get into it, and then make those decisions on, where your career path is. So you're not wasting time just doing something and realize later, oh my gosh, what was I thinking? And I know a lot of people have done that. They go to college for one thing and are like, oh, I should have never done that. So and I think with reptiles or anything, and even medical, if you're squeamish about things, like maybe that's not the path to take. Yeah. But so I think getting that hands-on experience and then making your decisions is probably the best advice I can give. Take that time to experience some of it first, and then decide what you want and where to go.
Yeah, it sounds like, staying open, not getting necessarily sucked down one path, and if you right, and thinking about what you want in a broader context. That's a lot of good stuff to think about for everyone listening, and for us even, like, as we're kind of starting our careers, that sort of thing. Unless anyone else has anything to add, I think it's been awesome. Thank you for the work that you're doing and for coming on today. It's really been awesome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's been fun. It's nice to chat.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And what do you think about the turtle trivia, Michael?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say next. We wrap it up, but it's somewhat fake, because if you've got a few minutes, it's fine, whatever we end up doing, but we like to do a round of turtle trivia, or a few rounds of random turtle trivia. And I'm not even going to say what I normally say. I normally reach out to people, but at this point, I've probably not told people about this enough times that it's just
forever.
Yeah. There's been like 2 people I've mentioned it to beforehand out of like 56. But I don't know if you've got a few random turtle facts that you want to quiz us with, or we can throw some at you, however you want to do it.
Try to stump us too, like something.
Okay. Wow. Try to stump you.
It's always tough putting people on the spot too. So I
was like, I would never.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all right if you don't want to.
Oh gosh. Okay. Let's see if I can think of something like.
Maybe Jason's got something today too.
How about
I
the incubation period of chicken turtle eggs? What's an average of incubation?
Michael definitely knows this one.
I don't know actually. I've got a general guess, but I wouldn't know specifically.
Yeah, not specifically. I should.
Oh, good. So I got a good one. Look.
Yeah.
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 No, it's good.
Yeah. So basically, it's about 8 months.
I knew it was long. Yeah.
And you know what? The reason why I know this is because I actually kind of studied the incubation rate of naturally for chicken turtles, and so I would have them lay in like November, and they would hatch like July. So, and a natural incubation. So, so it is pretty long because they kind of go through that diapause. So basically, they just are dormant until the temperatures are right, and then development starts.
It's such an interesting turtle. Everything about them is so unique and different. Like they're just very, very cool.
I do remember that they seem to have they lay in the winter, right? Is that something that happens in Florida too, like South Florida? Because it varies a lot.
Yeah, no, that's what we get. So our usually in, I want to say October, well, sometimes October, mostly November, December is I get most of my females in with eggs that have been like hit by cars or have incidents. So that's when I this is how I based my activity level of these turtles, is because I know when the influx is at certain seasons that I get them to come in. So but yeah, the chicken turtles, that's usually when they come in, and then it usually fizzles out by January. I don't really see or get nesting. Like I have the nesting sightings thing on the website, and that's also something that I'm trying to use to help us kind of get an idea of the different locations of Florida and what species are nesting at what time of year. So that's the purpose of the nesting sightings reports, as well as where they're nesting too, because a lot of people reported stuff like on playgrounds, near sidewalks, backyards, all stuff that I feel like is good information to have. So
cool. Yeah, that's awesome. And we'll definitely put a link for people that can check out your website and just report there or through FWC. And but yeah, it's been awesome. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, not a problem.
See.
Cool. This has been episode 49. So almost 50. All right.
Almost.
We'll